Okay. Alrighty, so today we're going to finish up social psych. Couple quick announcements to remind folks. I'm giving out the next exam on Friday, so everyone on Zoom, you need to be here in person to get the exam. And then you'll need to be here in person on Monday to turn it in as well. So if you're sick, please wear a mask. Yeah, 2 days from now. Yep. So yeah, if you're sick, wear a mask, but you have to be here in person to get it. Because it's a weekend, I won't be here to like give you a copy if you happen to be here not be here one day. So I will also send out an email to remind folks of this. But yeah, tell your friends who might not be on the Zoom today if you see them. Alrighty. So today we're going to finish up talking about the social psych chapter. And so I'm going to go ahead and put us into our slideshow here. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, since we've been talking about persuasion, is cults. One of the biggest examples of persuasion in a not healthy way, right, is cults and people who join cults, get sucked into cults. And so this is a video about that.
When Reverend Jim Jones founded the People's Temple in 1955, few could have imagined its horrifying end. This progressive religious movement rose in popularity and gained support from some of San Francisco's most prominent politicians. But in 1977, amidst revelations of brainwashing and abuse, Jones moved with several hundred followers to establish the commune of Jonestown in Guyana. Billed as a utopian paradise, the colony was more like a prison camp. And when a congressional delegation arrived to investigate its conditions, Jones executed his final plan. On November 18, 1978, 909 men, women, and children died after being forced to drink poisoned Flavor Aid. That grisly image has since been immortalized as shorthand slang for single-minded, cult-like thinking. They drank the Kool-Aid. Today, there are thousands of cults around the world. It's important to note two things about them. First, not all cults are religious. Some are political, therapy-based, focused on self-improvement, or otherwise. And on the flip side, not all new religions are what we're referring to as cults. So what exactly defines our modern understanding of cults? And why do people join them? Broadly speaking, a cult is a group or movement with a shared commitment to a usually extreme ideology, that's typically embodied in a charismatic leader. And while few turn out as deadly as Jonestown or Heaven's Gate, which ended in a mass suicide of 39 people in 1997, most cults share some basic characteristics. A typical cult requires a high level of commitment from its members and maintains a strict hierarchy, separating unsuspecting supporters and recruits from the inner workings. It claims to provide answers to life's biggest questions through its doctrine, along with the required recipe for change that shapes a new member into a true believer. And most importantly, it uses both formal and informal systems of influence and control to keep members obedient, with little tolerance for internal disagreement or external scrutiny. You might wonder whether some of these descriptions might also apply to established religions. In fact, the word cultus originally described people who cultivated the worship of certain gods by performing rituals and maintaining temples. But in time, it came to mean excessive devotion. Many religions began as cults, but integrated into the fabric of the larger society as they grew. A modern cult, by contrast, separates its members from others. Rather than providing guidelines for members to live better lives, a cult seeks to directly control them, from personal and family relationships to financial assets and living arrangements. Cults also demand obedience to human leaders, who tend to be highly persuasive people with authoritarian and narcissistic streaks motivated by money, sex, power, or all three. While a cult leader uses personal charisma to attract initial followers, further expansion works like a pyramid scheme, with earlier members recruiting new ones. Cults are skilled at knowing whom to target, often focusing on those new to an area or who have recently undergone some personal or professional loss. Loneliness and a desire for meaning make one susceptible to friendly people offering community. The recruitment process can be subtle, sometimes taking months to establish a relationship. In fact, more than 2/3 of cult members are recruited by a friend, family member, or coworker whose invitations are harder to refuse. Once in the cult, members are subjected to multiple forms of indoctrination. Some play on our natural inclination to mimic social behaviors or follow orders. Other methods may be more intense, using techniques of coercive persuasion involving guilt, shame, and fear. And in many cases, members may willingly submit out of desire to belong and to attain the promised rewards. The cult environment discourages critical thinking, making it hard to voice doubts when everyone around you is modeling absolute faith. The resulting internal conflict, known as cognitive dissonance, keeps you trapped, as each compromise makes it more painful to admit you've been deceived. And though most cults don't lead members to their death, they can still be harmful. By denying basic freedoms of thought, speech, and association, cults stunt their members' psychological and emotional growth. A particular problem for children who are deprived of normal developmental activities and milestones. Nevertheless, many cult members eventually find a way out, whether through their own realizations, the help of family and friends, or when the cult falls apart due to external pressure or scandals. Many cults may be hard to identify, and for some, their beliefs, no matter how strange, are protected under religious freedom. But when their practices involve harassment, threats, illegal activities, or abuse, the law can intervene. Believing in something should not come at the cost of your family and friends. And if someone tells you to sacrifice your relationships or morality for the greater good, they're most likely exploiting you for their own.
That's like a really good little summary of what it's like. There's a larger TED Talk here we're not going to watch in class, but if you're interested, I encourage you to look at this video on how cults basically literally rewire your brain. There we go. So based on these videos, and folks on Zoom, please chime in via chat. how would you avoid joining a cult, or how would you help a family member who did join a cult? Yeah, no.
I guess the Bible like to talk about reputation or something to keep the code going. So I would say that I had a family that joined, I would, advise them that to do and be aware of what's come to your attention and be aware so they can see.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really important. Yeah, because a lot of times these folks have like very charismatic leaders. It seems like a nice supportive place. But yeah, being aware, being supportive of people who are in cults. I recommend watching documentaries about cults. So there's a whole docu-series about Scientology that Leah Remini did. There are documentaries about like the Heaven's Gate cult, Jonestown, things like that. Those can really help you be informed. Consult a family member before making decision to join one. Kyle, that's such a good idea, just to like in general, to like talk to other people in your life. And Jordan says the best way to help a friend who joined a cult is to try and ease them away and try to make them see their wrongs. And Gabby says she agrees. Yeah, I think that those are really good points and it can be hard, right? Because if someone's in a cult, they are in a cult, right? And they don't realize it's a cult. And so being supportive, being there for them is the most you can do. And sometimes it will take a while and be really painful, right? For you and for the family member. And this relates to a lot about intergroup relations. So group identity really comes into play with cults, but also other groups as well. This whole idea of it's like us versus them, as they mentioned, some cults will isolate people from their families, not allow them to talk to people who are quote like non-believers. And we see this in other groups as well. I mean, it takes something as simple as like cliques in high school, right? There's like an us versus them mentality. Social identity is where we define ourselves, not by our own personality traits, but by group membership, right? And again, this can be toxic like a cult, or it can be pretty low key, like I think of like Green Bay Packers fans wearing that cheese hat, right? Like it's silly, it's goofy, it's not gonna hurt anybody, but it's a social identity. Social identity theory looks at these in groups versus out groups and how that influences, again, negative things, how people who are in the out groups are treated. And as you can imagine, this can go into things that are really problematic. So ethnocentrism is favoring your own group over other groups, specifically related to race, ethnicity, culture, right? And so a lot of this group identity and the same sort of think we have with cults is what maintained slavery, is what maintained Jim Crow laws, right? Well, this is how we do it. Why would you say that? Don't say anything. Don't step up, right? I mean, some of the most brutal murders, right, of the civil rights movement were people who were like, you're stepping out of line. How dare you say something, right? So obviously these can all be pretty problematic. And so we can make our social identity on a whole host of things. These are just some examples, right? So our ethnicity, our religion, it can be as specific as like Southern Baptist, or more broad, like just Catholic, right? Political affiliation. Are you feminist? Are you Republican or Democrat or independent? Are you an environmentalist? Vocations, right? Psychologists, artists, athletes, military, either active duty or veterans. Relationships, being a parent, being a teenager or a college student. Some people who have family members pass away, like that becomes their social identity, not like on purpose, right? It's just like they are so profoundly affected by the loss. Stigmatized identities. People with communicable diseases like HIV, people who are unhoused. Unfortunately, being overweight is becoming like one of the most stigmatized things. Even the term alcoholic, right, is like stigmatized in its own way. It implies that like it's the fault of the person rather than acknowledging that it's a psychological disorder. Things along those lines. And these, again, just little tidbits of the larger intersectional identity that each of us has. And so we know from looking at cults, we know from looking at the experiments we've watched the videos of, that you can get people to do a lot of stuff by using social pressures. And one of the ways that we can get people to comply, and you can do this for a cult, you can do this for a political candidate, you can do this for a company, is by using different techniques of persuasion. So the foot in the door technique involves the use of a small request followed by a larger request. Hey, will you wear this little pin? Oh, thank you for doing that. Will you give us $100 for this cause, right? The door in the face technique involves the use of an extreme request that you know the person's going to reject, followed by a more reasonable request. Oh, you support this political candidate? Will you put up a sign this big in your yard? No? Okay, what if I give you a little yard sign or a bumper sticker? Okay, then they're more likely to say yes. Lowballing technique involves the use of extremely attractive terms to induce a person to make a commitment. And then once that commitment's made, the terms are revised. So this is like the stereotypical shady used car salesman. There's a great price. And the person's like, cool, I'll agree to that. And then all of a sudden there's all these add-ons, right? And the reciprocity principle is that you should pay back in kind what you receive from other people. So for example, I don't know if you all have ever experienced this, there are charities who will send you stickers or address labels or something along those lines. And the idea is because they've given you something, you'll want to donate to them. Now, what about self-perception? How do we view ourselves? Well, these are really consisted of self-attributions, which are inferences that we draw about the causes of our own behavior. Basically, self-attributions are why we think we do what we do. Heider, way back in 1958, developed a model for understanding how we think about personal outcomes. And these involve 3 different dimensions. The first is whether they are internal or external. So am I attributing this to personal dispositions, some personality traits or something related to myself? Or am I attributing this to external attributions, that my behavior is more affected by the situation I'm in? So internal is like personality, external is the situation. So for example, let's say you got a job that you really wanted. Your internal attribution would be, I'm good, I did a great job in the interview, I'm really qualified for this job. An external attribution might be, oh, I got really lucky, or there just weren't any other good candidates. The next set of attributions is whether they are stable or unstable. So stable attributions, the idea is the cause of behavior is not going to change over time. So these include things like intelligence, problem-solving ability, in terms of internal ones, but you can also have external stable things like laws, rules, supervision, etc. Unstable attributions says the cause of the behavior is variable or subject to change. So an unstable internal cause might be something like my mood, my motivation, my fatigue. I've been sick, right? Things along those lines. Stable external causes include laws, unstable external causes include things like the weather, your social environment, your job. And then you look at whether they are controllable or uncontrollable. So those three dimensions are internal versus external, stable versus unstable, and controllable versus uncontrollable. And so this gives you an example of, let's say you have a negative event, I failed an exam. So maybe you have like an internal, stable, global way of looking at things. I failed this exam because I'm stupid. Right? There's nothing I can do about that lack of control. And obviously that's going to lead you to feel really bad. You're probably not going to try to study very hard for your next exam, right? But if you take more of like an external, unstable, I failed the exam because of unusual pressures at work and I couldn't study. And I will have control over future events. I'll be able to study. So you might feel bad temporarily, but you'll have goals and behaviors you can do in the future. Now, obviously, this can also translate into how we think about how other people behave. And so we can think about other people's behavior, both in terms of internal and external causes. So if we have internal attributions about other people's behavior, we attribute the cause of their behaviors to their personal dispositions, traits, abilities, feelings, their DNA, right? Whereas if we attribute others' behaviors to external causes, we're going to attribute it to the situation. And so we're most likely to make attributions about other people's behavior when others are behaving in ways that are unexpected for them. They do something sort of out of character, or when others behave in very negative ways. When the events related to that person's behavior are very personally relevant, the person does something and it intentionally or unintentionally screws you over, right? But also when we're suspicious about other people's motives. And again, that can be an us problem, right? So part of what's going on here is perceiver expectations. How we expect others to behave can influence our actual perceptions of them. So by thinking in our mind, this is how this person should do this, right? When they don't do that, we're going to be really judgy. Part of what comes into play here is confirmation bias. And this is when we process and remember information about others that confirms our expectations of them. It's sort of like hindsight bias a little bit. So confirmation bias is believing is seeing. We're more likely to remember and use information that confirms the way we think about someone else. And we'll selectively remember that information that fits our view of them, ignoring anything that doesn't. This can obviously be related to self-fulfilling prophecies. And this is when our expectations about a person cause the person to behave in ways that confirm that expectation. Give you an example of a classic study in educational psychology. So they took a school and they had, kids move from class to class with different teachers. And so one teacher had them for, I don't know, math, let's say, and the other one had them for science. And they told the math teacher, this group that's coming in, these are the gifted kids. And they told the science teacher, that same group who was going to them next period, these are the kids who might struggle a little. And what they found is that the teacher who was told those kids are gifted, treated them like they were gifted, gave them a lot of support, high expectations, the kids performed really well. When the teacher is told these are the kids who need extra help, they're not so smart, they treated the kids like they weren't as smart, and the kids did horribly. Again, same group of kids. So self-fulfilling prophecies can be really detrimental. And there's 3 steps involved in self-fulfilling prophecies. The first is that the perceiver has just an initial impression of someone. Oh, that person seems like X. Then the perceiver will behave towards the person in a manner that's consistent with that impression. So again, let's think of this teacher example. Okay, this person is gifted. So I'm going to treat them like they're really smart. I'm going to reinforce their answers, right? And then the target person, the kid in this case, adjusts their behavior to fit the expectation. So the kid is going to be like, well, my teacher really believes in me. I can do this, do really well in the class. Then that confirms the perceiver's impression of the person. The teacher says, yep, this is the gifted kid. Look how smart they are. Right? And sometimes these perceptions can be spot on accurate, right? And then sometimes these perceptions are incorrect and we don't know why, right? A person that falls asleep in a professor's class, right? Oh, they just don't care. What a lazy student. Meanwhile, it could be because that student was working till 5 a.m., right? At their 3rd job so they can pay for college. So you have your perceiver's impression of the other person. Maybe she's really funny. And that leads to the perceiver's behavior based on that impression. Tell us the story about when, and then laughs at the story whether or not it's actually that funny. And then that produces corresponding behavior from the other person. So that person will tell the story as requested, try to make it extra funny, and that will just confirm that self-fulfilling prophecy. Yup, this person's really funny. Now, obviously, as I've mentioned before, these can lead to a lot of dangerous ways of looking at and thinking about other individuals, in particular stereotypes. So there are widely held beliefs that people have that people who have certain characteristics because they're a member of a certain group. And again, we tend to think of stereotypes in terms of race, but certainly people have them in terms of gender, in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of culture, in terms of whether or not someone is a college student, right? Things along those lines. Stereotypes exist in almost any way that humans can be categorized. Other things are like age, height, weight, right? If you've ever met a tall person and been like, do you play basketball? Stereotype, right? Not a necessarily harmful one, but still a stereotype. One really interesting one is physical attractiveness. So attractive people are generally viewed as being smarter, more mature, better adjusted, but they're not any more of those things than someone who's average looking. Stereotypes persist for several reasons. The biggest one, just in our brains, is simplicity. It's less effortful cognitively to just be like, person in this category is this, right? It's a shortcut for our brains. But obviously the trade-off, the cost here is inaccuracy, right? Because we know no one group has every single member identically the same. Another is confirmation bias and the self-fulfilling prophecy we just talked about, right? So again, if we take the confirmation bias and we process and remember information that confirms what we already believe about a group, race-wise, ability-wise, things along those lines, then that's going to be even more harmful. And if we behave towards others in a way that elicits the expected behavior from them, then we're going to have the self-fulfilling prophecy. So for example, it's well known within psychology that if you have a client of color and you give them an assessor who is the same race as they are, they actually do better on the exact same test that just measures something like intelligence than if you give them someone from a different race as their assessor, because of these deeply held, sometimes unconscious beliefs people have. Another thing that could come into play here is what's called the fundamental attribution error. And this is the tendency to explain other people's behavior as the result of personal factors rather than situational factors. So it's the tendency to explain other people's behavior as the result of personal rather than situational factors. Making attribution requires 2 steps. The first is to focus on the person. So you're making an internal attribution affected by them. But then the second step is taking the situation into account, allowing for external attributions. Because the second step takes more mental effort, we often skip it. So like my silly example I use for the fundamental attribution error is, let's say I'm walking out of the room and I like stumble into the desk. I'll be like, who put that desk there? Right? I'll blame it on the situation. But if I'm a judgy person and I see someone else run into the desk, I might be like, that person's so clumsy, right? Not giving them the same benefit of the doubt I gave myself. So here's a more complex example. So we've got this first step, this automatic mindless step, where the observer makes an initial observation of the actor's behavior. So maybe you go into a bank and there's a customer who's arguing loudly with a bank teller. So you as the observer, you'll make a personal attribution. This is a hostile person. Or like in today's parlance, it might be like, what a Karen, right? How dare they yell at this person? If you take that effortful step, that mindful step to really become aware of situational influences, then you might be more sympathetic, right? So if you overhear the customer saying, you've been making the same error every single month and it's costing me money, you might have a little bit more sympathy, right? But you have to like listen and be willing to take in that information. And then you'll modify your initial attribution based on that situational information. Maybe not a Karen, maybe this is like legit, right? But a lot of people stop after this first step. And that's the fundamental attribution error. Not giving the other person the benefit of the doubt, just assuming if someone's doing something not good, it's because they're a bad person in some way. Here's another example. The actor tends to give external situational explanations of their own behavior. Oh, I'm late turning in this work because other people keep asking me to help with all their side projects. But then if you see someone else do it, you tend to give internal trait explanations of that behavior. She's late with her report because she can't concentrate on her own ability, her own responsibilities. Again, judging that other person, attributing it to something broken about that person rather than maybe there's a bunch of stuff going on at home. Now we know that this again can trickle down in a lot of different ways. And you can have what's called a defensive attribution. And this is where you hold the victim responsible for what happened to them. So this is also known as blaming the victim. And such attribution has a self-protective function. If you can blame someone else, there was something they did wrong that caused this horrible thing to happen to them, now you can say, that won't happen to me. So an example here are like auto accidents. Like, oh, that person must be like a really reckless driver, and that's why they got in a crash, right? Whereas maybe someone just pulled out into them and there's nothing they could do about it. The other more problematic example here are things like survivors of sexual assault, right? So if you can say, oh, well, that survivor was drinking or wearing something provocative, and I wouldn't do that, then you can sort of protect yourself mentally. I won't get sexually assaulted because I won't do those things that got this person sexually assaulted. When we know cognitively, if we take a step back, that a person can walk down the street naked and no one has a right to assault them, right? They might get arrested for like public indecency, but no one has a right to sexually assault them. This can be explained by a concept called the just world hypothesis by a psychologist named Lerner. And this is the assumption that the world is just, and so people get what they deserve. That's a great way to think of things, right? Until you realize that's not how the world works, right? That really horrible things happen to really good people all the time. Right? We all know someone within our families or friend groups who's been struck by a horrible disease, and they're a great person, right? So people tend to use the just world hypothesis, but unfortunately, it's just not accurate. And we talked about stereotypes. Obviously, we know one of the consequences of that is prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice is a negative attitude towards members of a group just because they're members of that particular group. And again, we tend to think of this in terms of race, but it can be on a whole host of different things. So again, thinking within my realm of body image, things like that, people will look at someone who's overweight and go, oh, they're lazy, they're this, they're that, and not think to ask, like, what's going on? Do they have like genetical things? Do they have maybe like a 20-pound tumor and that's why they look overweight, right? Things along those lines. Or maybe they're just overweight, but they work out every day and they eat healthy and that's just how their body is. Discrimination is behaving differently, usually unfairly, towards members of a group. So prejudice is the negative attitude, discrimination is the behavior. The old-fashioned, quote unquote, discrimination is what we think of when we think of discrimination, the overt discrimination. Again, we think back to Jim Crow laws. We think back to the fact that until the 1970s, women couldn't have a checking account or a credit card in their name, things along those lines. But the modern discrimination is more often covert, where people will privately harbor a negative attitudes towards a minority group, but express them only when they feel that such views are justified or that it's safe to do so. And like, they might not hire you and you don't know it's because of discrimination. You can't prove it, right? But there's something there. Prejudice and discrimination often go together, but that's not always the case. In terms of how do we reduce prejudice, the best tool is education about people who are different from us, not only through schooling, but through direct contact with those people. So knowing someone who's a different race, a different sexual orientation, a different ethnicity than you is the best way to break down those attitudes and therefore eliminate those problematic behaviors. You can also use persuasion. All these techniques we've been talking about to reduce prejudice. That looks like spam. Okay, so I didn't realize I had another slide about the Sandberg person experiment here. I'll just go through this. So participants were randomly assigned to be those prisoners or guards and chosen from a large pool of volunteers. There were no systemic differences between the group before the experiment. but you saw those dramatic differences during the experiences. The guards purposefully, behaviorally aggressively, and in fact, they were instructed to do so by Zimbardo. And the prisoners behaved really passively. They thought of themselves as a number. You heard them talk about that one kid who said, like, then they were like, prisoner, whatever, 601 did a bad thing. And the kid was like, I'm 601 and I'm a bad prisoner, right? They saw themselves as this identity. A new social reality was created. And again, they forced the experiment to end. One of the things I don't think I said when we talked about this experiment is that the woman who came in and told Zimbardo, I think what you're doing to those boys is horrible. That is the woman who ended up becoming his wife. So sort of an interesting romance story there to think about. Social cognition is something else we can think about. And this is the way we think in social situations. So stereotype threat is a self-fulfilling fear about being judged on the basis of a negative stereotype about our group. One of the classic examples of this is if you tell women in an experimental setting, we're going to have you do some math problems, and women don't usually do the best on these, but go ahead and try. They do worse than if you just say, here's some math problems, do them. That whole idea of stereotype threat can get you so wrapped up in your own mind that you can't concentrate at the task at hand. Social comparison is actually something I've done a lot of my own research on over the years. And this is the process where we evaluate how we think and feel, how we should behave, our abilities. And what I focus on is how we should look, our appearance. And we do that by comparing ourselves to other people. Now, the really interesting thing is the theory about this said social comparison is supposed to be helpful. It's supposed to help you like better yourself. You can look at someone who's better than you. What do they do? Can I do that too? But like if the comparison is harmful, you're supposed to stop doing it. Well, in fact, in the area of appearance, we know that these are often harmful, and yet people keep doing it. So there's a big piece of that. Yes, Sebastian, great question. Do you think social media has a massive role nowadays in social comparison? Yes. Not only do I like personally think that, but there's a lot of research to back that up. So I'm currently in the process of collecting data for a meta-analysis. So that's where you take existing studies and each study becomes a data point, instead of like each person becoming a data point on social comparison and body dissatisfaction. And I would say within the past 5 years or so, the vast majority of studies that have looked at this have looked at it with social media comparison. And yes, what we find consistently, maybe not surprisingly, is when you compare yourself to people on social media, particularly influencers or celebrities, right, who have often manipulated their photos to the point that they don't look that good. It has a really detrimental effect on how you feel about yourself. And then that can have cascading effects on your mood, symptoms of psychopathology like depression, eating disorders, things along those lines. So yeah, social comparison can have a really profound effect. Now, I do have to give a caveat, which is that not all social media is going to be bad, right? If all you look at on TikTok is happy videos of animals, right? Probably not going to lead you to negative social comparison. But for a lot of us, we're fed this, right? And not only are we fed it in our feeds, but sometimes we're getting push notifications, right? To look at this person and what they posted. So yeah, it does have a really negative effect. And that can profoundly affect people. And we're seeing this in people of all genders. Men are profoundly affected by like fitness influencers, as are women. And then take really potentially damaging steps to alter their bodies, right? Whether that's taking these detox teas, which if you're not familiar are basically just laxatives, not necessarily great for your body, or overworking out, taking supplements, things like that. Yeah, really good question. It's so scary to see how the younger generations are affected. Yeah, I do not envy y'all, and particularly people coming up after y'all. I didn't have social media till I was in grad school. So none of my high school career is documented. None of my stupid mistakes I made, right, is documented. And I didn't have that in my face in that way. Certainly I had it in other forms of media, right? Magazines, TV shows, billboards. But it wasn't in my face 24/7 on my device, right? So yeah, it's really hard. One of the things they talked about in the cult video we watched is cognitive dissonance theory. And this is when discomfort is caused by you having two dissonance thoughts. Maybe thoughts about your attitude versus how you behave. Maybe recognizing something is fundamentally wrong in this cult I'm in. But then like your behavior is like, but this is where I am and I should do what everybody else is doing and I feel comfortable and safe here. And so you reduce dissonance by changing your behaviors to match your attitude. So a cult person might leave the cult, right? But that's a lot harder. And so often what they do is they change their attitudes to match their behavior. They buy even more into that group thing. No, nothing is wrong with it. This is great. This is safe. This is comfortable, right? Here's another example, more like a personal one-on-one example. Maybe there's a woman who values financial security and she's in a relationship with a man who's financially irresponsible. So the conflict here is it's important for her to be financially secure, but she's dating a man who's like blowing their money. So in order to reduce the dissonance between her belief and behavior, she can either leave the relationship or she can reduce her core emphasis, core value on financial security. And in case of the second option, this dissonance could be further minimized by emphasizing the positive qualities of her significant other rather than focusing on his flaws. Another quick example that happens when we make decisions on a regular basis. Most people hold the belief that they make good choices. When a product or item we purchase turns out badly, sometimes that conflicts with our previously existing belief and we'll try to like convince ourselves it's going to be okay. This is where you'll see people like using skincare that makes them break out. They're like, no, I paid a lot of money for this. It's going to be great. I just have to get past this. You're like, or not, right? So it can affect us in a lot of different ways. So Festinger, who came up with cognitive dissonance theory, is also the guy who came up with social comparison theory. And so the theory says we're motivated towards consistency between our behaviors and our attitudes. So again, I hate my job. Maybe I make a change of job, or maybe I just start convincing myself my job's okay. Right? Bem came up with self-perception theory, which says we make inferences about our attitudes by perceiving and examining our behavior and the context in which it occurs, which might involve inducements to behave in certain ways. I'm spending all my time thinking about my job and how much I hate it. I really must not like it. So basically, both cognitive dissonance and self-perception theory explain the connection between our attitudes and behaviors, just in different ways. All right, so we will stop there for today. Well, actually, that is the end of today. So again, reminder to everybody, be here in person on Friday to get the exams.